Hi, Joe Pepraki from Loyola Press. I'm the national consultant for faith formation there at Loyola Press, and I am pleased and honored to be the host of this webinar, Removing Obstacles to Grace This Lent, with Tim Muldoon, who you could see is in the house there. We're going to have him sit in the green room there for another second or two before we start chatting with him. I just want to take care of a few housekeeping details with everyone. First of all, thank you for being here. What a wonderful thing to gather on the front step of Lent. Just a couple of steps before we move into this wonderful 40-day season to renew our faith. And a great opportunity for us to talk with and listen to Tim Muldoon today to give us some clues and strategies and exercises for removing obstacles to grace this Lent. And so in the meantime, this is being recorded, and you will receive a recording of this. You'll get the recording will be available at ignatianspirituality.com, and you will also receive a link by way of an email so that you can watch it again, share it with your friends, spread the good word out there. Please do use the chat if you would like to introduce yourself. Take a look there and you'll see dozens, if not hundreds already, of people who have introduced themselves from all over the world. But if you have a question for Tim, which we hope you do, we're going to have a Q&A session with him about 45 minutes into the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature for that, okay? So not the chat. The chat is just to say hi, or if you have any issues, you can talk to Denise about any technical issues or questions you have about that. But questions for Tim, go into the Q&A. So having said that, I do want to introduce you to our guest for today. Don't want to keep him waiting any longer. But Tim Muldoon is a philosopher, a theologian, a professor, an author of many books. We're proud to have a number of them here at Loyola Press. And in particular today, in just a moment, we're going to be talking about the Ignatian Workout and the Ignatian Workout for Lent. But Tim, welcome. Tell folks a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Joe. I just can't say how much of a delight it is to be here. As you say, on the doorstep, or I think it's the front step of Lent. So it's a great time to be here. Yeah, you see the bio, everybody who's here on the webinar. But what I'll add is that when I'm not putting on my professional hat, which is most of the time, I'm at home with my wife Sue, with our three kids, although they're really not kids anymore. They're adults and emerging adults. But we have a 25-year-old, a 22-year-old, and a soon-to-be 21-year-old. So
Wow.
so we're kind of in this gradual empty nesting phase, which
Sure.
I think about, and certainly anybody who's on this call or watching this can appreciate that there are life phases, and you come to something like Lent in a different way each time. So for me personally, you know what, it's very frequently more about my family and just the people that I love in my life than about any of the professional stuff. So that's the main hat that I wear, and that's part of what I bring in reflecting on this theme. I am a lay person. I'm a pilgrim who is trying to make a pilgrimage towards God and to do it honestly. Sometimes getting it right, hopefully more often than not. But again, I'm delighted to be here with you.
Thank you, and you do get it right, Tim. That's why you write books and teach, because people appreciate what you have to share, and that's why you do webinars like we're doing today. And we're so lucky to have you to share about that. And thank you for sharing so much about your family as well. I think our participants today super appreciate that, because it all comes down to our everyday life. And what you're going to be doing today is helping us to navigate through our lives, and by taking the season of Lent to use as an opportunity for a spiritual workout. So I have a couple of your books on the screen here. They've been around for a few years, as you mentioned before we started. The Ignatian Workout, Daily Spiritual Exercises for a Healthy Faith, and then the Ignatian Workout for Lent. And a couple of QR codes if folks want to scan that, but we'll have information at the end as well. But obviously, Tim, you talk about you use phrases like spiritual fitness and developing a program of workouts. And you look like a physically fit guy. I've met you in person before, so obviously this metaphor works for you. But tell us what you mean by spiritual fitness and workouts in relation to our spiritual lives.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that note, Joe. So thanks for raising that question. I want to say what it is and what it isn't, and I'll actually start with what it isn't. What it isn't is trying to earn God's favor for us. So I think that's exactly the wrong approach.
Yeah.
And I'll unpack that a little bit more. But really, what I'm drawing from, I mentioned that especially the Ignatian Workout. I wrote that now something like 25 years ago. So
Wow.
I was at a totally different life stage. And I kind of unselfconsciously was reflecting on my own experience of having undertaken spiritual exercises first at Campion Hall in Oxford, later under the auspices of a Jesuit here at Boston College. So I'd had these experiences of really, pouring my effort and my desire into growing closer to God, growing in my faith, and I just wanted to share that, kind of
Hmm.
unselfconsciously. So to me now, I look at this, gosh, at an entirely different life stage, and I say to myself, well, okay, what I think I was grabbing onto, because already by that point I was teaching, I was already working as a professor, and I was specifically drawing from the early church, in which there were figures who went off into the desert and described themselves as spiritual athletes. And they
Oh.
even used that language. I won't bore you, but there's a Greek word which gives us our word ascetic. The
Mm.
idea that you kind of discipline yourself in some ways and you open yourself to God in other ways, but this tradition of spiritual athleticism is really quite ancient in the church. So in that respect, I didn't feel like I was having any particularly unique insight. I was simply observing, well, hey, I have been an athlete. I was then, I still am now. Some of the proof is on the wall there. That's an oar, by the way, above.
Okay.
So, I still row, I still get out, and I still, think that there is something to be learned from just the practice of disciplining oneself and one's desires. And that was really kind of the impetus for giving rise to that first book. So being a spiritual athlete is trying to grab those insights from leading a disciplined life towards some improvement,
Mm.
and thinking about what that might look like in the spiritual life. Now, I'll nuance that later, but that's the kind of first pass at
Yeah,
the
that's
question.
great. I appreciate that. And I like what you said earlier too about at different phases in our lives, we're completely different and we have to make adjustments. So on the physical fitness level, I can relate to that. For many years, I've tried to keep up a regimen of exercise, and I used to run a lot more than I do now. Well, now I'm just over 65 and the knees hurt a little bit. And I actually exercise probably more now than ever in my life, but not the same way. And
Right.
so I walk a lot more and I ride bike more and I actually do a little more strength training so that my bones don't get brittle and so on. But adjustments are made. And so one of the first insights I think that you shared with us is to be open to the kind of adjustments. Many of us have gone through many Lents and we maybe do the same thing. And perhaps you're suggesting maybe we might need to switch it up a little.
Yeah, I think that's right. And with those observations, Joe, you're already kind of hinting at what is the limitation of the analogy. It's not a perfect analogy,
Yeah,
So
they
so
never
again, we
are.
don't want to at all make the suggestion that somehow we've got to work really hard in order to be loved by
Yeah,
God, which is that's exactly not what we should be thinking about.
yeah.
Rather, we should be thinking about the fact that yes, life goes through stages and phases, and so sometimes I think about at even the extreme end stages of our lives, the very beginning of our lives and at the very end of our lives, we're in states of helplessness. And so the idea, or might be, I should say, I should be very careful about the
Hmm.
way I say that. But the idea of simply being dependent on God. So there absolutely is a limit to the metaphor. But that said, I think where I would want to put the stress is that when we are offering to God who we are and doing that in a way that specifically is about disciplining our desires. And again, that's a theme that we see really running throughout the Christian spiritual tradition. Obviously, that's different from physical exercise. So we want to
Yeah.
make, that distinction. But the idea of even pruning our desires, I sometimes switch to this kind of, horticultural
Mm,
metaphor, that there are some things that we want to ask God to trim in our spiritual lives, and there are some things that we want to offer to God to bring forth greater fruit, and and
yeah.
and so again, thinking about disciplining of our desires and of even, some of our habits, some of our attitudes, maybe even our language, all of that we can bring under the broader, term what I used earlier of discipline, of almost retraining ourselves in a manner ultimately that is in imitation of Christ, which is really, I think, the crux of what we're talking about during the Lenten season.
Yeah, and what you just said about, sort of remaking ourselves, or, nowadays we talk about reinventing ourselves. And in a sense, this is what St. Paul talked about, being a new creation, that we don't reinvent ourselves, but we ask God to reinvent us.
Yeah,
And,
that's right.
during a season like Lent, I'd like you to chat a little bit more before we move into the meat of what you're proposing is based on the exercises of Ignatius. But before we get to that, I'd like you to comment a little bit about the season of Lent. And
Yeah.
what is Lent supposed to be for us? And then also in the title, we talked about Lent as a time to remove obstacles to grace. I'd like you to talk about grace. I think sometimes we just say that word and it's like, what exactly is that? So if you could expound on both of those, I'm sure you could teach a course on both of them, but if you could do both in a couple of minutes, we'd be most appreciative.
Yeah, let me start with grace because really, I mean that really is. I want to say that that's the water that we're swimming in.
Mm,
That's what we really want to be thinking about. So here's the primer. Grace from the Latin word gratia, which means free or gift in Latin. That's the English word. There are other versions of that. It translates the Greek term charis in the New Testament. I'm not going to go into the lesson, okay? But what I want to stress is that what we remind ourselves of during the Lenten period is that we are already, as it were, swimming in God's grace. So again, it's not that we're trying to earn God's favor. It's not
yeah,
that we're trying to do more stuff to get more holy. Again, that's where, the analogy really has to break down. So
yeah.
this theme of removing obstacles. And here I would draw particularly again from the monastic tradition, which I just, find myself returning to again and again because these were men and women that were really trying to boil down life to its most almost simple
Hmm.
element, which is that I am in relationship with God. Now, obviously, we do that in community, but I'll say more about that later. But in this monastic tradition, I'm thinking in particular of a figure by the name of John Cassian, and he's very good about this. That um, grace is already there, so
Okay.
we don't need to do anything. It's the grace is there. The problem that very often happens to all of us because we sin is we put up obstacles to God's
Mm,
grace, and there are various forms of selfishness, and we can maybe say a little more about that as we go. But
yeah.
but effectively, what happens is I get stuck
Mm,
in ways of thinking. The monastic tradition again thinks about these thoughts that take us away from really being in this mode of reception of God's
yeah.
grace. So if we think about Lent as the time where we're not trying to earn God's grace, but simply removing the obstacles to God's grace, that's not a bad way to think about it. So the question I want to ask everybody who's watching this webinar is this: what is the most important thing that gets in the way of your own ability to savor God's grace, even on a daily basis?
Oh, can you
To really
repeat that again?
savor.
That was brilliant. Say it,
Yeah.
please repeat that for us.
Yeah. So and it's going to be different for all of us. It may be, there's a lot going on in the world right now, or maybe there's something in our relationships, or maybe there's some pattern that I've fallen into, which really is about me and not about my service to God's kingdom. Maybe it is an attitude that has kind of become hardened over the years. Maybe it's something that I'm not yet doing, but really need to be doing, particularly out of greater generosity or greater love. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about as obstacles. They're things, again, it's almost
Yeah.
like I put up a barrier to God's grace. And to be able to again, be a spiritual athlete in this kind of ancient sense means that I'm going to go into the what Teresa calls the interior castle,
Mhm.
that place within me. I sometimes use the term my inner life. I'm going to cultivate an attentiveness to my inner life and ask myself the hard questions. When am I failing to allow God's grace to transform me for greater love, for greater service, for even just simply more sustained attention, what I described as savoring God's grace. I think all of that is what I'd like to suggest.
Yeah. Could you do us a favor, Tim, and please do repeat that question? You stated it so brilliantly and concisely, and I think Denise might be able to take it down and put it in the chat. Just
Yeah,
state
I'll,
that
I'll,
question. What
I'll
do you
give it
want
a
us to
pass.
ask ourselves?
Tell me if it's the right one.
Okay.
It's the question, what are those things which are getting in the way of God's grace? That's the short version.
Hmm.
What are the habits of mind, the attitudes, the behaviors even, that have maybe turned me more on myself than on God? This is,
Okay.
by the way, a very, I'm kind of invoking Saint Augustine here for our theologians in the audience. In fact, it was Luther that kind of described this in a way that we become sort of curved in on ourselves.
Mm,
We don't allow ourselves to be open to God's grace. We too much and too often turn our focus on ourselves. So again, my question is, what are those attitudes, those habits of mind, those thoughts, that are getting in the way of entering more fully into the life that God is inviting me to
perfect.
be attentive to and to give myself in service to?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I know that when we look at the chat after a webinar, a lot of times people will be like, "Hey, that question he asked, that was great. What was it?" And then people are chatting with each other. So that's why I asked you to repeat it there. And I'm sure it's going to show up now in the chat that people are taking attention to that. But let's jump into now what you're offering to us is a model for how to enter into Lent using the framework, so to speak, of the spiritual exercises. And I think, as most of our folks know, that the spiritual exercises are arranged into 4 weeks. Don't think of those as 7 days, not meant to be literal. Um, and in your book, you talk about how we can use this over 40 days. And again, don't take that literally either. It's a Lent is a period of significant time of reflection. But what you've done then is you've taken the 4 themes from the 4 weeks of the exercises. And let's jump into the first one, Tim. Let me set it up for you, and then I'll let you go at this. You tell us that in the first week, our introduction to Lent, that we should reflect on the fact that God has created me for some good. Uh, Tell us what this means. How do we come to the place of getting a God's eye view? I love how you say that. How do we get to the place of a God's eye view? And then you're going to give us an example of an exercise in each of these 4 themes. So let's start with this, developing a God's eye view.
Yeah, so really the two places that I'm drawing from the spiritual exercises. The first is what Saint Ignatius calls the first principle and foundation, which is this very concise statement of faith. And I read it as a truth that I live into. And
Mm,
the first part of that is, as you've already pointed to, God has created me for some good. So Ignatius is proposing that we start by living into this truth that God has created us for something. We're not accidental. We're not simply accidents of evolution or just whatever, that our lives have meaning and purpose, and that because of God's grace, there is an invitation to to live into whatever that is. Now, all of us have to discover that, okay? And so the second thing that I'm drawing from is one of Ignatius's early meditations. This is in the so-called first week of the exercises, in which he proposes this meditation of what I'm describing as this God's eye view of the world, of creation. So, almost putting ourselves in the place of God, and seeing the vastness of creation, and then seeing, oh, here is this world, and oh, here's this history that has unfolded, and then, oh my goodness, there are my parents, and then, oh, here's how I came about, and so to almost see ourselves against this much vaster backdrop. To me, it does several things, one of which is it reminds us I'm not the center of the universe, because we can fall. That is an obstacle to grace that we all fall into. My
Mhm.
students call it main character syndrome, which I think is a
That's
fantastic
great.
term. So we think of ourselves as being, the center of the universe. And this is a little reminder, oh no, God has a greater purpose. And so my task is to discern my limited role. It's a good role, it's an important role, but it's a role within God's larger purpose for the universe.
I love that idea of the main character
Isn't
syndrome.
that
I
great?
think we all fall into that. We all think, and then what we think is that we're going to try to invite God in for a larger role when we need to realize it's His production and He's the director.
Right, right, exactly right. Yes. And so, just to kind of tease out the implications for that. And remember, this is one of, the exercises that Ignatius himself
Okay,
proposes as a spiritual exercise.
okay.
And I think there's, a great deal of fruit to come from that. And maybe just one word I would add here is it reminds us of perspective, that
Mm,
we tend to be rather myopic. We tend to
yeah.
see the world through very limited eyes. We can get stuck in habits and patterns. And again, Lent, as you referred to earlier, Lent is a period when we're rededicating ourselves to some discipline. But the other point I'll add, I alluded to it earlier, we're not doing it alone. Lent is a church liturgical season,
Good
which
point.
means that we are also entering into the kind of rhythm of the church's year, which I have always taken great delight in. That there's a sense that time is not just same tomorrow as it was yesterday.
Yeah.
There's this sense that no. I mean, there is a cyclical dimension to this, right?
Hmm.
But we're entering into these cyclical patterns as a community of faith, as a mystical body of Christ, as the language puts it.
Yeah.
And so as a result, there's a new perspective here. I am doing my own inner work, but so are millions of Christians around the world, but with this aim of aligning ourselves ultimately more and more with the person of Christ, with the ministry of Christ, and with the unfolding task of doing God's work in the world, not just my own. Now, and hopefully those come together.
Hmm.
But when we're being honest with ourselves, sometimes my work in the world is starting to maybe
Yeah.
not be mindful ultimately of God's work in the world.
Yeah. And generously in the book, you provide 40 exercises for us, and we're certainly not going to have time to go through them today. Besides, we don't want you to give the store away here. But give us an example of an exercise from this first period, this first week, that helps us create that God's eye view.
Yeah, and I'm going to speak rather broadly, but it absolutely is the first exercise that I teach beginners, students, anybody who's really just scratching the surface of this method of approaching Christian spiritual life, and it's the prayer of examen, and so it is fundamentally a prayer of review of the day. I'm sure many people on this webinar are very familiar with it. Others have heard of it. So I'm not adding any particular grand wisdom here. What I'll just mention is that in reviewing your day and asking questions like, well, where has God been most present to me? And maybe where have I found that things I did or said or
Mhm.
maybe I fell short of something. That becomes habitual. That lends a kind of eye to my actions.
Mhm.
So even thinking about the slide you have on the screen, a God's eye view, I can have that of my own life. Again, getting out of my own myopia, I
Yeah.
can ask, not what does Tim see, but how might God see the way that I have gone through my day, which hopefully is not, meant to be punitive. I mean,
Right.
sometimes those feelings can surface, but ultimately we have to remind ourselves again that we're bathed in grace, so if we are in the hands of a loving God, who looks even more lovingly on us than we can look upon ourselves, then that's where we want to be looking at ourselves.
Mm,
So Augustine, once again, God is more intimate to me than I
mm,
am to myself.
beautiful.
And God loves me with a deeper and more profound love than I can summon as any kind of self-love, which very, very often, as you and I and everybody in the Zoom room knows here, can be, circumscribed by the people we hang around with, the cultural message that we receive, things like age and gender and things, that we put labels on each other. But if
Hmm.
God is more intimate to me than I am to myself, that is where I want to be living out of that vision of my own agency, that vision of who I am, if I am ultimately going to be of great service to the good work that God wants me to do in the world.
Great. So we're off to a good start. The first week of Lent, looking to try to adapt a God's eye view of ourselves and of the world. And now let's move into the second movement, the second week that you're recommending for Lent, drawing from the exercises, and that is the focus on Christ calling us into service. This is a very timely topic because, obviously, as a nation right now, we're grappling with and being challenged to ask, who is my neighbor, and who are we supposed to serve, and what's that supposed to look like? So, take us into this theme, and give us, and then also share an exercise that we can practice to help us respond to this call to serve others.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, as you mentioned, the second week or the second major movement in the spiritual exercises, uh, Ignatius himself refers to it as the call of Christ the King. All right, and so he
Yeah.
himself is using the imagery that you would have had in the early part of the 16th century, this kind of late medieval imagination of serving the great King Christ, and it's really there's some beautiful meditations in that week. The way that I kind of adapted this in my work is to say, okay, look, if we've done in the first week is come to a deeper knowledge of what God has called me to, to be the kind of person that God has created me to be, to do some good in the world, then my following of Christ, my deepening of intimacy with the person of Jesus. And I'll mention, by the way, a very common Lenten exercise, namely the Stations of the Cross, as my
Mm,
example. I'll get to that in a
okay.
minute. But
Great.
but the whole point of this is that I think, and this was a point I don't think I fully understood when I first wrote the book, but what is clear to me now, Joe, is that a vast proportion of our actions and the way we think about ourselves is more or less about imitating the people around us. So we enter a new workplace, we do what the people there do, or we enter a new school and we do what the people there do, or we enter a new community and we talk the way they do. We watch the movies, we read the books. There's a whole lot of imitation that goes on. I'm
Yeah.
very influenced by a thinker by the name of Rene Girard, who's written about this, in great detail. But my suggestion here, effectively, is what Ignatius is inviting to us, all of us, into is a new pattern of imitation.
Mm,
And to me, this is so much related both to the life of Ignatius himself and to the broader Christian tradition. So very quickly, Ignatius, had this massive conversion experience, driven in large part by the fact that he was reading about the saints and about the life of
yeah.
Christ, and he suddenly wanted to imitate. He wanted to be Saint Francis. He wanted to be Saint Dominic. And so there was a new pattern of imitation going on there. I think that's really not a bad way to think about what's happening during Lent, is we're asking ourselves, how can I imitate Christ more profoundly, even in my daily life? So, again, your slide is spot on here. How do we do that? Well, we do what Jesus did. We don't ask questions about whether it's politically expedient to serve the neighbor. It wasn't in the story. The Good
Yeah.
Samaritan story is about somebody who didn't want to violate, religious norms, and who didn't want to, sort of blur the lines between the,
Yeah.
beloved Jews and the hated Samaritans. They said, no, no, no. I mean, no matter what, we are called to loving service. No matter what, we are called to loving service. And so imitating Christ in that way
Hmm.
um, it has an edge to it. And again, I don't know
Yeah.
that I fully, got that when I was writing this, 25 years ago. Um, Loving others can be hard. It can be costly. It
Yes.
can it can really summon from us, some uncomfortable things. So one way to think about Lent is that, again, it's a period in which we can learn to do that joyfully. All right. So
Hmm.
now the exercise was your question. All right. So the Stations of the Cross, very common Lenten practice. I know at my parish, it's every Friday,
Right.
all the Fridays of Lent. So starting this week. And I'm sure everybody is at least vaguely familiar that you go through the 15 stations and you kind of put your eyes on, the panel that describes
Right.
a piece of the story. Now, here's what's interesting about it to me, Joe, and this is why it reminds me of Ignatius so much. A lot in the Stations of the Cross is not found in the Gospels.
Hmm.
They're, like the Veronica comes to mind. Veronica doesn't show up in the Gospels. That's an imagined interpolation, but it's really quite lovely
Yeah.
because the idea is that we're putting ourselves in the story and imagining what was it like to walk, towards your death in service to what God has asked you to do. I mean,
Hmm.
that's very hard. Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm going to suggest that meditation, the Stations of the Cross, but really any meditation, especially on the Passion narrative, during Lent, it has as its aim not only, kind of reminding ourselves of what happened then. I think it also has the purpose of putting us into a place of almost meditating. What does God summon from me that may be hard?
Hmm.
Now in my life. And I think that's exactly where, as a community of faith, Christians spread out throughout the world,
Yeah.
I think that's a very good question for us to be asking.
A wonderful exercise. I think so many of us just love the Stations of the Cross back to our childhood, and maybe not quite understanding it back then, but having this deeper understanding. You've also given us a number of phrases that you see I'm taking notes as we're speaking here, but I love what you said about um, we're changing our pattern, our pattern of, I'm trying to read my own notes here, our pattern of behavior, our pattern of being, and so on. I was thinking to myself while you were saying that I think of sports analogies a lot. When a team signs a free agent and they have the press conference, what's the first thing they do? They put on the Boston Bruins jersey, right? And now you're going to be imitating the pattern that is supposed to, be practiced here.
Right.
On this team, and of course in baptism, that's what we do. We put on, our team jersey, and we're supposed to imitate that pattern. So thank you for sharing that thought. Pattern of imitation. I finally figured out what my notes were. A pattern of imitation. Folks, if you have questions for Tim, please put those into Q&A. In about 10, 15 minutes, we're going to switch over to Q&A with Tim. But let's quickly move on to our third movement of Lent, the Lenten workout that Tim is proposing for us, in which he says that we're being called to open our hearts to love and to expect hurt to accompany that. And so, Tim, break this open for us, this idea of how love and hurt go together, and then once again, an exercise that helps us to experience that.
Sure. Yeah. So again, third week of the exercises is specifically about the passion. So it's a deep and sustained entering into really, what we think of as being proper to Holy Week. So we do on Palm Sunday the entire Passion story. We do it again later in the week. So entering deeply into what did Jesus really go through. Now, when I was younger, I think I just assumed that that was just our way of just remembering how great Jesus sacrificed for us. And that's true. So I don't want to,
Hmm.
downplay that. But again, maybe it's, just a function of coming at this now, decade after decade after decade, again, in this
Yeah.
kind of cyclical pattern. What becomes so clear to me, particularly as a parent, Joe, and this is where I
Mm.
say to myself, I think there are insights into the life of faith that are unique to lay folk. And by the way, I will be the first to say that are unique to women, that are unique to moms, but I'll say that are unique to dads. Okay, so I'll just sort of put myself in line
Okay.
there.
Hmm.
Um, and one of those is, of course, you're signing up for hard stuff. Of course, if you love your children, you are going to be going places that you don't anticipate going. You're going
Yeah.
to be taking on challenges you could never have invented or thought about beforehand. You're going to get your heart broken again and again and
Hmm.
again. And so here is where I think, one of the deep wisdoms of our Christian tradition is that we remember again and again and again Jesus went to the cross, and of course, kind of looking ahead to the next theme, the
Mm.
cross is not the end of the story. If the
Right.
story ended there, it would be a different story. I'll even add a quick sort of corollary to that. Um, a 10-second foray into scriptural studies here. Mark's
Okay.
original gospel ended with an empty tomb. There was no resurrection story. So it was a martyr story. And even that is profoundly meaningful because, those of us that have had to undertake hard things out of love for those,
Sure.
that are near to us, we understand that. Okay, but okay, close quote. There is a resurrection. So there is something to look forward to that. But yeah, I think it's a reminder not to be afraid of the pattern of doing things that are hard. Again, I
Yeah.
hurt because I love, because I enter into service of those around me, and even maybe even distant strangers. Again, good Samaritan types. I'm going to take on hard things. I'm going to take on any number of
Yeah.
difficulties because I think God has a larger plan. So, all that said, I will simply say, look, in Lent we are making a pilgrimage toward Good Friday,
Mm.
and so I will even put on people's radar screen right now that Good Friday itself is a focal point of our spiritual exercise as a community of faith.
Okay.
And by the way, just to be clear, I'm not talking only about Catholic Christians. I'm talking about the larger family of those who seek to imitate Christ. That
Hmm.
that Good Friday represents the remembrance of the cross. So any way that we introduce a kind of reverence for the cross in Catholic churches, it's literally kissing the wood of the cross
Yeah.
as a way of putting ourselves in that kind of headspace that this changes everything, that we need not be afraid because Jesus was the one that went ahead and showed us that suffering out of love is the way. And he is the way. So to me, that probably is the most appropriate spiritual exercise for this movement.
Yeah, and I think the you mentioned earlier, and I think this is so important and so needed that we need to speak to parents about the pain that comes with being a parent, the hurt that comes with that. I find myself when I'm speaking to parents reminding them over and over again, this is the toughest thing you will ever do in your life is being a parent. And we have to stop having people think that somehow they're too busy with family life to get involved in some kind of church stuff.
Yeah.
When they are living, we are living our primary vocation of laying down our lives every day, and I think we misunderstand that phrase laying down your life. We think that it means to physically die, like a first responder or someone in the military. That's the ultimate example. But to lay down your life simply means to set aside your own needs, to put the needs of someone else first.
Yeah.
And my God, if it's not parents,
Yeah.
who is
That's
it?
it. That's it. That's
And
exactly
so,
right.
yeah, helping parents to recognize that the cross represents laying down our lives for others, and that this is what's at the heart of the hurt that we experience in the love that we experience in our families.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And coming back even to the first question that you raised, Joe, that's a form of, and the Greek word is ascesis or
Mm,
asceticism, that on a daily basis, moms do this, dads do this, grandparents do this. Anybody who loves anyone does this. They lay down their life. Again, not necessarily in
yeah,
the extreme way that you were pointing to, but in a self-giving way.
yeah.
That's something to, really lean into. And I'll just add another quick corollary, which is that this prayer of examine that I mentioned before can also help us to become aware of our own existing holiness. It's not
Mm.
just about, learning where we've sinned, which, can happen, but also reminding us, oh, that's right. You know what? God is doing something in me because I see the fruits in my life. So that's
Well
important too.
said. Folks, we're about 7 minutes away from Q&A with Tim Muldoon. So please, if you have a question, go to the Q&A feature and type that in there, and Denise will sort through those and have them ready for us. One last thought before we're going to move on to our last movement here, but you talked about the practice of the veneration of the cross on Good Friday. I think one of the most beautiful practices of our church. And again, I think of how when here's another sports analogy. When the Blackhawks finally ended their 49-year drought and won the Stanley Cup back in 2010, I got in line. I waited in line at a place for 2 hours, over 2 hours, so I could touch the Stanley Cup.
Oh yeah.
To, in a sense, and I'm not being irreverent, but to reverence the Stanley Cup. And it struck me that, boy, wouldn't it be something if we did that at every mass, that we venerated the cross. Every mass begins with the procession of the cross. Wouldn't it be neat if people in the center aisle reached out to touch it, to venerate the cross, to show that this is our central symbol, our symbol of the love of selfless love, the pain that comes with that, but that leads to new life. So I appreciate you sharing that beautiful example, and really encourage people to get to church on Good Friday for that veneration of the cross, one of the most beautiful traditions we have. With that in mind, Tim, can I scoot you on to the last one, our week 4? And here you talk about living in hope. And this Lenten workout is calling us to um, follow the pattern of the spiritual exercises, which moves us into the resurrection. Um, how apropos to talk about hope, since we are in a Jubilee year of hope. So, talk to us about this final movement of the Lenten season that you're proposing.
Yeah, I mean it's what kind of gives shape, I think, to the other three movements, and I keep using this term pilgrimage because I really do think of what we're doing in the Lenten season as a kind of pilgrimage, and pilgrimage is a sacred journey. We're journeying towards something, and I think this is what we're journeying toward. We're journeying toward a greater hope. Now, here's where again I want to invoke an earlier observation, which is that we come at this differently at different times of our lives. There are some of us, maybe on this webinar right now, who are not experiencing hope right now, who are in very difficult times. And, it doesn't take long to glance at some news stories and know that there are a lot of people that are in a lot of hurt right now, so let's remind ourselves that hope is very, very different from just sort of being an optimist or just, being the kind of person that always has a smile on their face or something like that. I mean, great if you do. Um, Hope is a theological virtue, all right? So here I'm drawing again from the theological tradition and ultimately from St. Paul, right? So in the end, there are three things that remain: faith, hope, and love. Um, so for somebody like Thomas Aquinas, who reflects on these and says these are theological virtues, meaning we don't get to just kind of, you know, decide to have some hope one day, that ultimately that is a gift from God.
Mm,
And so recognizing that is a way of saying, look, I might in fact be going through a very difficult time right now, but that doesn't mean that I will never have hope again. I can almost hope for hope. So thinking of it as a gift of God, we are making a pilgrimage through this Lenten season, that there is some kind of transformation that is unfolding, even when things may be hard. And I'll share here an image that a
Hmm.
very wise spiritual director once gave me, Carmelite woman, many years ago. But she used the image of it was an agricultural image, but she said it's like a fallow field. All right, so
Mm.
for those of us that are not farmers, myself included, what I'm reminding us is that when a field lies fallow, there's no growth. You can't see anything. Okay, there might be just like old stalks or something like that, but there's no growth. But that's part of the growing cycle. So
Okay.
you might not be able to see it right now. So living in hope means, number one, I may in fact have periods where I am joyful and I feel great and things are going well, and I experience what Ignatius calls consolations, and it's just life is good. But there are other times when I may feel exactly the opposite, when, as it were, my field is fallow. So if that's the
Mm.
period that I'm in right now, then my turning in hope, my living in hope, as the slide kind of suggests, it means that I'm willing to say, I don't feel it, but I know that hope is a gift of God, and I know that God is capable of bringing hope into my life, even if I can't see exactly how that's going to happen. So that for
That's
me
great.
is the posture. Again, we're bathed in grace, and we don't earn it. We can't work ourselves towards hope.
Mm.
We can't like do six more things, checklist items. But what we can do is remove the obstacles that get in the way of reminding ourselves that, yes, our God is a God of hope. And if I don't feel it right now, because I trust in God, I know that it will come.
You really helped me to understand this notion of um, faith, hope, and love as gifts. I've heard that since I was a child. I know that. But I think I've misunderstood often when we talk about them as gifts. I guess I have often thought of them as gifts that I hope I get on Christmas.
Mhm.
I hope when I go look under the tree, it will be there. And it seems more like what you're saying is that faith, hope, and love, when we talk about them as theological virtues, that in a sense the human beings come with those factory installed, so to speak, that they're in us, but
That's it.
sometimes we have obstacles to them. Am I on the right track?
That's exactly right. Which recalls what we were talking about earlier, this first principle and foundation. So, again, I read it as Ignatius almost reminding us, don't look first at just how your life is right this second, whether it's good or bad. Don't look at that. Look rather to the fact that God has created you to do some good in the world,
Mm.
and that you want to look for that. But everything else in your life is supposed to be a means toward the greater end of whatever the mission is that God has given you. And it might be hard stuff. It might be hard stuff. And so this to me is such a critical message. And full disclosure, I'm married to an absolutely gorgeous therapist. We're coming up on 32 years. But
Wonderful.
she is so smart about this stuff, that there are all sorts of ways in which we can get into patterns which frankly just life gets hard, and we can experience difficulties and challenges, and so if the measure of our life is, am I feeling happy right now? Oh, God help us. I mean, kind of literally, that's
Yeah.
that's not going to be it. um but what I'm trying to suggest here is that if you put feelings aside for a moment, whether you feel happy or not, this thinking about the theological virtue of hope
Hmm.
is a way of reminding ourselves that God has created us for a purpose. God gives us the grace to, face life's challenges. Um, yes, we may have signed up for hard things, which is that, third movement, but
Yeah.
because we are imitating Christ, we're not afraid of going to our own crosses, as it were, in imitation of Christ, mindful that it may be part of the larger purpose for which God has created me.
And I wonder, Tim, if very quickly you could just give us a concrete exercise that from this fourth week that we can practice, and then we're going to move on to our closure.
Yeah, well, I mean, this may seem obvious to some and not to others, but I think about the joyful mysteries of the Rosary. That we pray. Those of us who pray the Rosary, and I will confess, I'm an occasional Rosary prayer. Okay, it's not my daily practice. For some, it is. It's a beautiful daily practice, but the joyful mysteries, you pray those whether or not you're feeling joyful.
Yeah,
So it's a way of reminding ourselves that there is joy in Christian life, even if right now I'm having a very hard time. That there's a big difference between joy, between hope, between that and how I'm just feeling right now. So, but I think it is possible to practice hope. I mean, literally, the
perfect.
way that you practice anything, that you practice Christian hope. Oh, that's right. This
Mm,
is the world that God has made. Oh, that's right. God has given us this great Savior who has marked out a path for us. Yeah, it's hard, but there is hope in that. But to almost put ourselves in the mindful awareness that that's the case. To me, that's a good exercise.
great exercise. And folks, you've heard four examples of concrete exercises. That's only 4 out of 40 from the book. And so the little teaser there. Let's wrap this up. And Denise is going to come on in about 2 minutes to have some questions. Tim, you wrap things up by turning to St. Augustine and a famous line of his, love and do what you will. What's your message as you wrap up this Lenten workout?
Well, I think my message is when better people have said things well, you should shut up. So I'm throwing the light over onto to Augustine here, whom I've already mentioned a couple of times. This comes up in his sermon on one of the letters of John, and he's basically saying, look, if you're rooted in love, then you're in the right place. That is going to be the right place to act out of. So, back to what I was saying earlier, ultimately what we're asking God for is the grace to imitate Christ in Christ's love and to bring forth the fruit that comes from that.
Perfect. A great way to bring that to a nice bow at the end here. And let's bring Denise on now. And we have about 8 minutes or so for to do some Q&A. So I'll turn it right over to you, Denise, for the first question.
Okay, thanks for sharing all your wisdom, Tim. And we'll start with Mary Lou, who asks, how do we find the space to unblock ourselves from the distractions of daily life so that we can experience this grace?
Yeah, this to me is one of the thanks for that, Denise, and thank you, Mary Lou. This to me is one of the places where I do want to kind of claim my original analogy. I think there are ways that we can introduce some spiritual disciplines into our lives. And I would say I was reminded of a story that a doctor shared of a very unhealthy patient who was just not sure that he could take on this regimen of exercise to help his heart, lung, everything. And the doctor said, I want your homework is to walk around your dining room table today. Okay. You're going to walk around the dining room table. And the guy calls back a week later and says, hey, I did it. I actually did it every day. I walked around the dining room table every day. And then the doctor said, that's awesome. Okay. Now, this week, you're going to walk around the dining room table 2 times. Okay. And so he did two. And you see where this is going. All right. So he gradually built it up. And then eventually, you're going to walk to the end of the block. Then eventually you're going to walk to, the next block. And then you're going to walk a mile. Okay. So to me, ours is an age of distraction. Whether it's, doom scrolling or whether it's, morbid attention to the news or whatever. Okay. I'm going to suggest here that the discipline for anybody in the room is to do the one circuit around the dining room table, whatever that is for you in your life right now. Is it one minute prayer every day? Is it one, to use my earlier example, decade of the rosary every day? Is it one mass this month? I almost want to say, what is the one thing? What is the one thing that I can offer to God this Lent? That's probably a great start.
Wonderful. Next question.
Okay. Um, Teresa says, as a parent, I totally understand this aspect of suffering out of love. But how do you reconcile taking care of yourself and your self-esteem when you're loving someone who is taking and demanding? How do you set loving boundaries?
Yeah, that is I think every mom's question. And some dads too, but honestly I hear it, that's every mom's question. Um Self-love is part of recognizing that one has been created by God for some purpose. And I do think that this to me is also a life stage kind of thing. It's hard to carve out time when your kids are small. It's really, really hard. Um, as they get older, I think it's good for them and it's good for us as parents to start to create some boundaries and start to dedicate some time to growing in one's own spiritual life. And again, the one thing, whatever that is. But yes, I do think at some point there simply has to be a recognition that yes, it's important to cultivate one's own spiritual life if one is going to be a gift to another.
Very good. Next
Thank you.
question.
Celeste said, you said to think about what does God summon from me? What are some ways for me to hear God's answer?
Read scripture. Read scripture and meditate on scripture, and then listen for what God is saying to you by means of the scriptural text. To me, that is the most certain answer. I think there are others, but in the time we have, I'd say that is absolutely the right place to start. And again, maybe it's you find the right app, maybe you find the right book. I have used, I'm blanking on the name of it, Joe or Denise, but the daily meditations published by Loyola Press every year.
Sacred Space
Yeah,
or
Sacred
Grace
Space
Filled
is a
Days.
great resource. Things like that, where you're just allowing yourself to listen to the voice of God.
Good concrete answer. That's what I love about the whole book. You're giving concrete suggestions. How about one more, Denise?
Okay. Sister Kathleen asks, how would you speak to the work of the enemy spirit in Lent, which would certainly be an obstacle to grace?
Yeah, I mean, we hear, of course, of Jesus' temptation in the desert early in the Lenten season, and so the idea that or heck, the story of sowing brambles among the seeds, the good wheat. Yeah, I mean that's a reality. That is absolutely a reality. But to me, it comes back to the first principle and foundation. What has God created us for, and what are the things that are getting in the way of that? And they might be ostensibly good things. They might be, and this is very clear to me by looking at the story of Ignatius, who was tempted to have all these, kind of spiritual insights rather than study his Latin when he was going back to school. And he realized at some point, oh, wait, this is the devil trying to get me to, get off course. So the question for me, in answer to that question is, what's the compass point? Because even good things can take us off of our compass point. So name that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Denise, for sorting the questions, and folks for submitting questions for Tim to answer for us. Wish we had more time, as always. Tim, I was looking forward to this. I was so excited about it because I know the few times that we've had the chance to meet, I just love talking to you. Such an easy conversationalist, and you have so much enthusiasm. Thanks so much for coming to us today and sharing in just everyday language for everyday living how we can develop a workout program for Lent. Thank you so much, Tim.
It's been a joy, Joe. Likewise, right back at you. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who joined us today. It really has been a joy having Tim Muldoon with us. And please take a look at his books from Loyola Press, The Ignatian Workout, Daily Spiritual Exercises for a Healthy Faith. There's a QR code on the screen. The Ignatian Workout for Lent, QR code also there. Or you can call, or I should say visit, store.loyolapress.com. You can call our customer service during business hours and speak to a real-life human being, 800-621-1008. And finally, once again, a recording of this webinar will be available at ignatianspirituality.com and will be sent to all who have registered in a link in an email. So once again, we thank Tim Muldoon, my partner Denise, and all of you for joining us. We pray that your Ignatian workout for Lent is one that is fulfilling and one that helps all of us to be renewed in our faith in Jesus Christ. Until next time, this is Joe Pepraki. God bless.